The Out of Bounds Show podcast is presented by Edwin Watts Golf Shop on County Line Road. Your golf game starts with Edwin Watts Golf Shop. Oh, good morning. Welcome in. Steve Robertson, genespage.com, 247 Sports. The Boneyard Podcast joins us on the Out of Bounds Show and the Bell's Two-Hearted Ale guest line. Steve, welcome in. And like all coaching staffs, Mike Leach's staff is trying to close out their recruiting class. Do you think that the learning curve is still in play on how things work in Mississippi and the Sun Belt for Mike Leach's staff? Steve?
Well, I think in some respects, yes. But I do think it's been probably a little better than it was last year in some respects. One of the things that I think is rather interesting, there's a lot of anxiety and angst out there, really among both fan bases in some respects, because, we didn't have official visits last year. I think people kind of forgot what it's like. I mean, I hearken back to the Leo Lewis days. I mean, we didn't know what Leo was going to do until the night before National Signing Day, and still there was some concern. And then Jeffrey Simmons, went down to National Signing Day and, the final three of Ole Miss, Alabama, Mississippi State. And even though he was technically a private commitment to Mississippi State, there was still some concern about what he was going to do. But, the reality of it is I think our fans in many respects are out of practice. They've forgotten what all this is like. But this is recruiting to Mississippi. And I even had a coach tell me this week, he goes, I did not fully understand what this rivalry was like, until I got here. That, it's 365 days a year. It's public relations, it's recruiting, it's on the field, play. It's one of those things that there's an intensity in Mississippi that is probably unique to the rest of the country.
I agree with that. Okay, so what are they looking at? Give me the top three. We can't go over everybody. Give me the top three visitors that y'all think are going to visit MSU this weekend, Steve.
Well, offensive lineman Percy Lewis is certainly leading that discussion. He's a guy that's basically down between State and Ole Miss, from McAdams, Mississippi, was previously an Oregon commitment, but I think we all knew that wasn't going to stick. But ends up being ranked the number one junior college offensive tackle in the country, and visited Ole Miss last weekend. Will visit Mississippi State this weekend, and that's one that's probably going to go into National Signing Day. He's kind of told us privately that he's still figuring some things out and feels like he has some good options. But, when you look at State's situation, losing both offensive tackles, he might be the most important offensive recruit left on the Mississippi State board. And there's a couple of other guys, too, that visited last weekend on the offensive line that we feel really strongly about today. Jackson LaHue, a former Virginia Tech commitment. There was some discussion he may prolong the process and wait and sign in February, but it does appear now that it is trending more towards a December signing, and that bodes well for Mississippi State. I think you got to survive today. I know Texas has flirted with him a little bit, but it's pretty clear they're slow playing him. But you get him in, that's big. And then Trent Ramsey out of Tampa, Florida, is a guy that really shortly after Mississippi State offered, he wanted to come on up and spend some time on campus, but we still had Friday night ball games to play and things of that nature. But I think State has a chance to close really well on the offensive line, and you're kind of working through some things. A new visitor that's coming in this weekend is Trevion Longmire out of Corbin, Kentucky, a former Kentucky commitment, committed to them as a wide receiver. And then there was some discussion about him playing defensive back, and I wasn't quite sure he wanted to do that. Then he said, okay, I'll do that. Well, by that time, Kentucky had committed another corner. So he is a guy that could be one that falls to State late, and a 4-star on 247 Sports. So that would certainly help your cornerback recruiting, to say the least. And that's been a bit of an adventure the last 2 years.
Okay. All right. So how many guys are they expected this weekend, give or take?
Yeah, well, it'll be double digits for sure. That's the expectation anyway. And there's a couple of other guys out there, some visits that we're kind of keeping private right now. Probably won't announce those until we've confirmed they're on their way tomorrow. some of those are a little bit sensitive. You got one guy that's committed to another program, and so we want to break the news, but at the same time too, we don't want to put things out there before the players themselves are ready to do it. And so, I expect double-digit visitors, and a handful of those guys that are coming in are already committed to Mississippi State, so they'll be part of the recruiting efforts this weekend and try to sway some of those targets.
Do you think the Mississippi-Alabama All-Star Game should be moved back a week, Steve?
Yeah, I actually do. Until the NCAA changes their recruiting calendar, I think in some ways the Miss-Al game is a bit of an impediment to the in-state schools because you have very little time to visit postseason. We just got done playing the state championship games last weekend, and we're signing national letters of intent on December 15th. So it really gives guys one weekend, if their season is prolonged, to take official visits. And you can say, well, they could always wait and sign in February, but Bo, as well as I do, that's just not practical. I mean,
No.
These schools want you to sign early, and a lot of these players just don't have the juice. I mean, it's like, well, you want to prolong the wait till February, then we can find a player of comparable ability. They'll sign in December. And so I think one of the things we could do is push that game back a week and give these guys a chance to get 2 full weekends, because those kids that play in a state championship game, you forget, the season starts right around Labor Day weekend, and it runs all the way through the first weekend in December. And some of the elite players in the state that are the most highly coveted are headed down to Hattiesburg to play in the Miss-Al game. And so I think for the betterment of the process and to assist the in-state schools, I think it makes sense to move that game back a week. Now, nobody's listening to me or you, but I think in reality, it'd be better for all involved.
I'm surprised Saban hasn't made that happen. Steve Robertson, the Boneyard Podcast, genespage.com on the Out of Bounds show. All right, we're getting some feedback here on Braden Locke. What can you tell us about the quarterback that Mike Leach has committed to MSU out of Texas?
Yeah, and Braden's a good fit. And he was the guy that ultimately State beat North Carolina for. I think that was the final two, State and North Carolina. He was recruited by Dave Nickel. He was the primary recruiter, and, of course, Leach and pretty much the whole offensive staff was involved. And one of the things I think is pretty cool, too, we broke the news that Dave Nickel was leaving for USC. One of the last things that Dave Nickel did is he called Braden Locke, and he told him that he was leaving and says, hey, this doesn't change anything for you. You need to come play for Mike Leach because you're a good fit for this scheme, and they'll develop you. And I think that says a lot about Dave Nickel's character. I mean, he's not required to do that. That's a guy looking out for what he feels is the best interest of the young man. And that's not to say that he probably wouldn't be a fit for SC, but, when you're not involved in that process on the SC side, you don't know the needs there. You don't know the commitments that are there. But for Dave Nickel to do that, I think says a lot for him. And I think Braden Locke ultimately signs to Mississippi State. We're not aware of any drama with him whatsoever. And just set, I believe, the Texas 6A state record for touchdown passes in a year.
I've got less than a minute. Stone Blanton, out of MRA, linebacker. What's the latest?
Well, it's basically down to Mississippi State and South Carolina. I interviewed him earlier this week, and one thing I'll say about Stone is he is a great young man. I mean, he absolutely is. If you've had any interactions with him, you know exactly what I'm talking about. This is a young guy that gets it. I know there's a lot of Mississippi State people are like, I don't understand why this isn't already over. And, he wanted to go through the process. He has. I know Shane Beamer was in this week, Mike Leach last week. I expect him to sign with Mississippi State and play for the Diamond Dogs as well as linebacker at Mississippi State. But Ole Miss has not been in and had an in-home visit unless they have done one in the last 24 hours. And so when the contact period opened, I think we expected it to be a really intense in-state battle. But I think Ole Miss in many respects they've moved on. So we're expecting to be a Bulldog.
Okay. Give me the one player that Mike Leach and his staff have to or need to sign next Wednesday.
Yeah, I go back to Percy Lewis. I think with the needs at offensive tackle, I think you need to find a way to get him in here in January, work with your strength and conditioning staff, and be in a position to start at one of those spots next fall.
We'll leave it there. Steve Robertson, the Boneyard Podcast. Thanks, Steve. He joined us on the Bell's Two-Hearted Ale guest line. We've got Steve Palazzolo coming up next. Pro Football Focus, PFF.com. Dak and the Cowboys. They head to Washington, D.C. to play the Washington football team, a division game on the road, and it's a big one. We'll have Palazzolo walk us through the matchup coming up next with Prescott and the Cowboys.